kid behind the counter turned the little radio over in his hands, flicked the dial with his thumb, and set it back on the glass. Yeah, old transistor radio. Doesn't even have FM. We get these. I can do $5. Leland Jessup stood on the other side of the counter. 79 years old, the tan canvas cap from the Sherman livestock auction he'd worn for 20 years pulled low over his eyes, the small plastic transistor radio sitting on the glass between them, and watched a 23-year-old in a Texoma pawn polo look at the thing that had sat on his father's workbench for 50 years and see $5 worth of obsolete electronics. That was my daddy's, Leland said, quiet. The kid, Preston by the crooked name tag, shrugged and pushed the radio an inch across the glass with one finger. Sure. 5. Final. Here's what that kid in the pawn shop didn't know. Here's what nobody in that shop knew. The small plastic transistor radio Leland Jessup had just set down on that counter was worth $94,000. It was not a production radio. It was not a retail radio. It was not anything that had ever been sold in a store. It was a 1954 Texas Instruments engineering prototype, one of 4 hand-assembled radios built in the TE Semiconductor Laboratory in Dallas in the spring of 1954 to prove that a pocket-sized radio could be powered entirely by transistors instead of vacuum tubes. It was, in the strictest historical sense, one of the first transistor radios ever built. The radio that changed the world, the Regency TR-1, the first transistor radio sold to the American public, had gone on sale in November of 1954. It was manufactured by Industrial Development Engineering Associates of Indianapolis, using transistor technology licensed from Texas Instruments. The TR-1 was a landmark in consumer electronics, the device that proved a radio could fit in your shirt pocket, run on a single battery, and work without warming up. It was the beginning of portable electronics. It was the ancestor of the Walkman, the iPod, and the smartphone. But before the TR-1 went to market, TI had built prototypes, 4 of them, hand-assembled by bench technicians in the Dallas lab from hand-selected germanium transistors, point-to-point wired on a phenolic breadboard, housed in a plastic shell that a TI engineer had molded by hand from a block of cream-colored bakelite. The prototypes had been used to demonstrate the concept to IDEA's engineers and to TI's executives. After the demonstration, 3 of the 4 prototypes had been returned to TI's lab. 1 had not. Leland's father, Harold Jessup, had been a bench technician at Texas Instruments from 1952 to 1978. He had built prototype number 3 with his own hands, soldering each of the 4 germanium transistors to the phenolic board, winding the ferrite antenna coil, wiring the tuning capacitor, testing the audio output through a small speaker he had salvaged from a hearing aid manufacturer's reject bin. When the project moved to IDEA for commercial production, Harold's supervisor had told him to clear his bench. Harold had asked if he could keep the prototype. His supervisor had shrugged. "Take it home, Harold. We've got 3 more." Harold had taken it home. He had set it on his workbench in the garage of the house on Pecan Street in Sherman, Texas. He had turned it on every Saturday morning to listen to the farm report on WFAA. The radio had sat on that workbench for 50 years, through Harold's entire career at TI, through his retirement in 1978, through his long, slow decline, and through his death in 2004 at the age of 82. The radio still worked. This is the story of how Leland Jessup walked into Texoma Pawn on a Thursday morning in November with $370 of trouble in his head and walked out with the discovery that the small cream-colored radio his father had built with his own hands in a Dallas laboratory in 1954 was one of the 4 objects that had started the portable electronics revolution, and that his father had been carrying it in his lunch pail when the future came home. Before I tell you what happened when the expert walked through that door, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me tell you about Leland. Leland Harold Jessup was born in 1945 in Sherman, Texas. His father, Harold Jessup, had grown up on a cotton farm outside of Denison, enlisted in the Navy in 1942, served as an electronics technician on a destroyer escort in the Pacific, and come home with a GI Bill education in electrical engineering from what was then North Texas State. He had gone to work at Texas Instruments in 1952, when TI was still a small company in a low-slung building on Lemon Avenue in Dallas that most people in Texas had never heard of. Harold had spent 26 years at TI as a bench technician, the man who built the things the engineers designed. He had soldered circuits for military contracts, for the first silicon transistors, for the first integrated circuits. He had been one of the invisible hands that built the semiconductor industry. Leland's mother, Francie, had worked the front desk at the Grayson County Courthouse for 31 years. Leland went to Sherman High, graduated in 1963, did 4 years in the Air Force, Shepherd AFB just down the road, training as an avionics technician, came home and spent 34 years at the Texoma Medical Center as a biomedical equipment technician, fixing the machines that kept people alive. Married Darla Samples in 1969. One daughter, Francie, named for Leland's mother, now 53 and living in McKinney. Darla had died in 2023 of Alzheimer's. 7 years from the first forgotten word to the last, the slowest way to lose someone. The water heater was the problem. The 40-gallon gas water heater in the garage had failed in October. Thermocouple gone. Tank corroded at the base. The plumber had quoted $370 for a replacement. Installed. Without hot water, Leland was boiling pots on the stove to wash dishes and showering at the community center. His Texoma medical pension was $1,180 a month. Social Security added $2,100. After property taxes, insurance, electric, gas, his blood pressure and prostate medications, and groceries, he had about $85 of slack in a good month. He did not have $370. He could have called Francie in McKinney. Francie was a dental office manager with a mortgage and 2 teenagers. Leland had not asked his daughter for $1 in 16 years. He was not going to start over a water heater. For 8 days, he boiled pots on the stove. On the 9th morning, Thursday, he went to the garage. The workbench was Harold's, a heavy oak bench he had built in 1956 from lumber salvaged when the old Denison cotton gin was torn down. Harold had worked at this bench every evening after dinner for 50 years, tinkering with radios, televisions, oscilloscopes, and whatever else needed fixing in Sherman, Texas between 1956 and 2004. The bench still had Harold's soldering station on the left side, a Weller iron and a spring holder, unplugged since 2004, and Harold's magnifying lamp clamped to the right edge. The transistor radio sat on the bench where Harold had put it in 1954. It had not moved in 50 years. It was small, about 4 inches by 3 inches by an inch thick. The shell was cream-colored bakelite, slightly yellowed. There was no brand name on it. There was no model number. There was no FCC marking, no UL listing, no retail packaging of any kind, because it had never been intended for retail. On the back, scratched into the bakelite with an awl in Harold's neat block print, were the characters TI, PT3, HJ, 1954, Texas Instruments, Prototype 3, Harold Jessup, 1954. Harold had told Leland about the radio exactly once in 1977, standing at the workbench on a Saturday morning with the radio playing the WFAA farm report. "I built that radio at TI in '54, Harold had said. It was a prototype, a proof of concept. We built 4 of them to show that you could run a radio off transistors instead of tubes. The whole thing runs on a single 9-volt battery. The company licensed the design to an outfit in Indianapolis, and they put it in stores that Christmas. I asked my boss if I could keep mine, and he said, 'Take it.' It's just been sitting here ever since." Leland had nodded. He had been 32. He had not thought about it again. Harold Jessup had been the kind of man who built things correctly and quietly. He had never told anyone outside the family that he had worked on the transistor radio project. He had never filed for recognition. He had never written a letter to TE's corporate historian. He had spent 26 years building prototypes of things that other people got credit for inventing, and he had considered this normal because that was what a bench technician did. You built the thing, you cleared your bench, and you built the next thing. The prototype on the workbench was not a trophy. It was a radio. It played the farm report. That was its job. Leland sat at the kitchen table that Thursday morning with the radio in front of him and the plumber's estimate beside his coffee mug, and he did something he'd sworn he would never do. He wrapped the radio in a dish towel and drove to town. The 2003 Ford Crown Victoria, another decommissioned police cruiser bought at auction in 2009, started on the first try. Leland drove the 4 miles to Texoma Pond on Highway 82 and parked at 9:16 on a cool gray November morning. Texoma Pond sat between a Sonic and an O'Reilly Auto Parts. The bell jangled as Leland stepped inside. Preston was behind the counter with wireless earbuds in and looked up after about 10 seconds. "Help you?" "I've got an old transistor radio, my daddy's, from the 50s. Let's see it." Leland unwrapped the radio from the dish towel and set it on the glass. Preston picked it up with one hand, turned it over, flicked the tuning dial with his thumb. The dial moved stiffly, the way a 70-year-old variable capacitor moves. He looked at the back. "Yeah, old radio, no brand on it. Doesn't have FM, we get old electronics, mostly turntables and cassette decks, stuff hipsters want. Nobody wants AM radios, pops, $5, maybe 10 if it works." He set the radio on the glass and flicked the power switch. Nothing happened. The battery was dead. Preston shrugged. "Doesn't work, 5. "It works. The battery's just dead. My daddy listened to it every Saturday for 50 years. It..." "Sure, Pops." Preston slid the radio across the glass toward Leland with 2 fingers. 5. "Take it or leave it." Leland's hands were flat on the counter. His jaw was set. He thought about the water heater. He thought about Darla, the way she had looked at him in the last year, the recognition gone from her eyes, but her hand still reaching for his, muscle memory outlasting everything else. He thought about Harold at the workbench on a Saturday morning, the Weller iron cooling in its spring, the farm report coming through the small speaker, and the radio, this radio, sitting between the soldering station and the magnifying lamp like it belonged there. Because it did. Because Harold had built it. He did not pick up the radio. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He stood there with both hands flat on the glass and his mouth closed tight because the only other thing he could do was cry in front of a 23-year-old. And Leland Jessup had not cried in front of another human being since Darla's funeral in 2023. The bell over the door jangled again. A man came in, late 50s, short, wiry, with close-cropped graying dark hair, a neatly trimmed mustache, and sharp dark eyes behind thin, rectangular titanium frame glasses. He wore a charcoal sport coat over a black mock turtleneck and dark jeans, polished black Chelsea boots, and carried a slim black laptop bag over one shoulder. There was a small enamel pin on his lapel, a transistor symbol, 3 lines converging on a circle, that Leland, if he'd looked closely, would have recognized from his avionics training. He came 2 steps inside, glanced at the counter, and stopped. He looked at the radio. He did not move for several seconds. His eyes moved from the bakelite shell to the dial to the speaker grill, a pattern of small round holes drilled by hand, not punched by a factory press. His eyes moved to the back. He read the scratched characters. He read them again. His face changed. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was quick and precise, with the focused energy of a man who had spent his career in rooms where the size of a transistor determined the size of the future. "Sir, is that a hand-built radio?" Preston looked up. "Old guy's selling. $5. The man did not look at Preston. He looked at Leland. "Sir, my name is Dr. Martin Chow. I am the senior curator of semiconductor history at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California. I also serve as the authentication consultant for Heritage Auctions Technology Memorabilia Division. I am in Sherman this week because the University of North Texas in Denton is hosting a symposium on the Texas Instruments Semiconductor Archive, and I drove up to see the Denison birthplace of President Eisenhower, who signed the legislation that funded the military transistor contracts that made TI possible. I stopped in here because I always stop in pawn shops in Texas. Would you permit me to examine that radio? Leland found his voice. You're asking me? It's yours, isn't it? It was my daddy's. He built it. Dr. Chow's eyebrows rose. He built it? At Texas Instruments, in 1954, he was a bench technician. Dr. Chow set his laptop bag on the counter very slowly. He opened it. He drew out a pair of thin white cotton handling gloves, a 10 times jeweler's loop, a small LED pen light, a soft chamois, a small digital multimeter, a fresh 9-volt battery, and a leather-bound notebook. He pulled the gloves on finger by finger. May I? Leland nodded. Dr. Chow lifted the radio with both gloved hands and set it on the chamois. He examined the shell, the hand-molded bakelite, the slightly uneven edges that came from hand finishing, not injection molding. He examined the speaker grill, the hand-drilled holes. He turned the radio over. He read the scratched inscription, TI, PT3, HJ, 1954. He brought the loop to his eye. He studied the inscription for a long time. Then he did something no one had done in 70 years. He took a small Phillips screwdriver from his bag and, with Leland's permission, carefully removed 4 small brass screws from the back of the bakelite shell and lifted the backplate off. Inside the radio, visible under the pen light, was a phenolic breadboard with 4 germanium transistors soldered to it in point-to-point wiring. The solder joints were clean and bright, the work of a man who soldered the way a calligrapher writes. A ferrite antenna coil was wound on a small cylindrical form at one end. A variable tuning capacitor sat beside it. A small speaker, smaller than a silver dollar with a paper cone, was mounted to the front shell. The wiring was neat, purposeful, and hand-done. There was no printed circuit board. There were no machine-placed components. Every connection had been made by a human hand with a soldering iron. Dr. Chow set the backplate on the chamois. He stared at the interior for a long time. "Oh," he said, very quietly. Then, almost to himself, 4 germanium transistors, point to point, on phenolic. He looked up at Leland. "Mr. Jessup, Leland Jessup." Mr. Jessup. In the spring of 1954, Texas Instruments, which at that time was a small semiconductor company in Dallas that most people had never heard of, set out to prove that transistors could replace vacuum tubes in a consumer radio. The project was led by TI engineers, but the prototypes, the physical radios, were hand-assembled by bench technicians in the Dallas laboratory. TI's internal project records, which are now held at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, document the construction of 4 engineering prototypes designated PT1 through PT4. He paused. The prototypes were used to demonstrate the concept to the engineers at Industrial Development Engineering Associates, IDEA, in Indianapolis. IDEA licensed the transistor technology from TI and produced the Regency TR1, which went on sale in November of 1954. The TR1 was the first commercially available transistor radio in history. It changed the world. It was the device that started the portable electronics revolution, the device that led, in a direct line, from a pocket radio to a pocket computer. He looked at the radio on the chamois. The TI project records document that after the IDEA demonstration, 3 prototypes were returned to the TI lab. They are now in institutional collections, one at the Smithsonian, one at the Computer History Museum, and one at the Texas Instruments Corporate Archive in Dallas. The 4th prototype, PT3, was listed in the Project Closeout report as released to bench technician C supervisor approval. He read the inscription on the back of the radio again. TA PT3 HJ 1954. Mr. Jessup, PT3. Your father's initials, HJ Harold Jessup. This is the 4th prototype. This is the one that went home. The fluorescent tube over the door flickered. Preston had not moved. Mr. Jessup, The three institutional prototypes are considered among the most significant artifacts in the history of American technology. They are not for sale. They will never be for sale. The fourth prototype, your father's, is the only TI transistor radio prototype in private hands. It is, in the most literal sense, one of the first 4 transistor radios ever built. It predates the Regency TR-1 by at least 6 months. The 4 germanium transistors inside this radio were hand-selected from TY's first production run of the type that would go on to power the consumer electronics industry. He placed the fresh 9-volt battery into the battery compartment. He clipped the leads. He turned the power switch. The radio crackled to life. A hiss. Then a voice, a North Texas AM station, coming through the small paper cone speaker, tinny and warm, the sound of 1954, still alive in a pawn shop in 2024. Dr. Chow closed his eyes and listened for 5 seconds. He turned the radio off. 70 years, he said, and it still plays. He looked at Leland. At professional appraisal through Heritage Auctions Technology Memorabilia Division, with authentication from the Computer History Museum and the TI Corporate Archive, this prototype, as the only privately held example of the 4 radios that started the transistor revolution, would be valued between $80,000 and $115,000. Conservative estimate, $94,000. Preston cleared his throat. It took him 3 tries. I was going to say 10. I meant 10. Leland didn't look at him. He was looking at the radio on the chamois, the cream bakelite shell, the hand-drilled speaker grill, the 4 small brass screws, the scratched inscription, and he was thinking about Harold. He was thinking about his father at the TI lab bench in Dallas in 1954, 29 years old, soldering germanium transistors to a phenolic board with the steady hand of a man who had spent the war keeping radar alive on a destroyer escort in the Pacific. He was thinking about Harold wrapping the radio in his lunch pail and driving 65 miles home to Sherman on a Friday afternoon. He was thinking about Harold setting the radio on the workbench beside the Weller iron and turning it on and hearing a voice come out of a box with no tubes, no warm-up, no hum, just the instant crackle of a transistor amplifier, and then the farm report from WFAA, clear as a bell, powered by 4 pieces of germanium smaller than a pencil eraser. Harold had built the future with his own hands, and then he had taken it home and used it to listen to the farm report every Saturday for 50 years. He never told anybody, Leland said. His voice was not steady. He never said he'd worked on the transistor radio, not to the neighbors, not to his friends, not to anybody. He just came home with it and put it on the bench and turned it on. Dr. Chow nodded slowly. Bench technicians rarely do, Mr. Jessup. The engineers get the patents, the company gets the credit. The man with the soldering iron gets to clear his bench and build the next thing. But the solder joints in this radio, I can see them, sir. I've been looking at solder joints for 30 years. Your father's joints are the cleanest I have ever seen. The man who built this radio was an artist. Leland sat on the stool beside the counter and did not speak for a long time. Doctor, Chow handed him his card. Mr. Jessup, take your time. Talk to your daughter. But please, sir, do not leave this radio in this shop. And please, do not open the back again without cotton gloves. The germanium transistors are sensitive to skin oils. Your father's solder joints have survived 70 years. Let's keep them that way. He carefully replaced the 4 brass screws and closed the back of the radio. He wrapped it in the chamois. He handed it to Leland with both gloved hands. Leland took the radio. He held it in both hands the way his father must have held it in the TI lab, carefully, steadily, the way you hold something you built and that works. He nodded once at Dr. Chow. He walked out past Preston without a word. In the parking lot, sitting in the Crown Victoria with the November sun low through the windshield, Leland Jessup held the radio against his chest and cried for the first time since Darla's funeral. He called Francie that night. She drove up from McKinney the next morning. They sat at the kitchen table on Pecan Street with the radio between them, and Leland told her the whole story. Francie, who had grown up hearing the farm report come through the garage wall on Saturday mornings without ever knowing what the little radio on Grandpa's bench was, held the radio in both hands and turned the dial and said, very quietly, "Grandpa built the future," and listened to the farm report on it. "That's exactly what he did," Leland said. They called Dr. Chow at 9. The Computer History Museum sent a team to Sherman in December. The radio was carefully examined, photographed, and tested in the Jessup garage, on Harold's workbench, under Harold's magnifying lamp, which the conservators said was the most appropriate laboratory they had ever used. The 4 germanium transistors were confirmed as 1954 T1 production, type-matched to the transistors documented in the PT1 to PT4 project records at the Smithsonian. The solder joints were photographed under 40 times magnification. The phenolic breadboard was confirmed as TI lab stock. The bakelite shell was confirmed as hand-molded. Tool marks from a belt sander were visible on the interior surface. The inscription TI PT3 HJ 1954 was matched to Harold Jessup's personnel file in the TI corporate archive, which listed him as a bench technician assigned to the Transistor radio project from January to August 1954. Authentication was unanimous. The Computer History Museum acquired the radio for permanent display through a 99-year family loan. The museum paid the Jessup family $88,000. The radio went on display in the museum's Revolution Gallery in Mountain View in March, set in a custom case beside the museum's own prototype, PT2, with a photograph of the TI Dallas lab in 1954 and a placard, Texas Instruments Transistor Radio Prototype PT3 1954, hand-assembled by bench technician Harold Jessup 1922 to 2004 at the Texas Instruments Semiconductor Laboratory, Dallas, Texas. One of 4 engineering prototypes built to demonstrate that transistors could replace vacuum tubes in a consumer radio. The demonstration led to the Regency TR1, the first commercially sold transistor radio, November 1954, and the beginning of the portable electronics revolution. Prototype PT3 was taken home by Jessup and used to listen to the WFAA farm report every Saturday morning for 50 years. On loan from the family of Leland H. Jessup, Sherman, Texas. Francie drove her father to Mountain View for the dedication. Leland wore the dark suit he'd worn to Darla's funeral. He stood in front of the case for a long time, looking at his father's radio, PT3, sitting beside PT2 under museum lights, the cream bakelite and the hand-drilled speaker grill and the 4 small brass screws catching the light. "You built it, Daddy," Leland said, quiet enough that only Francie heard him. "You built it with your own hands and you brought it home and you never told a soul, and it still plays." He paid for the water heater. He paid the property taxes 3 years forward. He sent Francie $20,000 and told her to use it for the kids. He set up a trust for his 2 grandchildren. He had the garage wired with new outlets. The old wiring Harold had run in 1956 had been a fire hazard for 20 years, and Darla had asked him to fix it, and he hadn't. He bought Darla a new headstone with her full name, and a line beneath that read, "Wife, Mother." She remembered everything. A letter came to Leland's post office box in April. It was from a woman named Patricia Jessup Reeves, 76 years old, in Plano, Texas. She was Harold's niece, the daughter of Harold's brother Virgil, who had also worked at TI in the 1950s. Patricia wrote that her father had told her once, in the 1980s, that Harold had built the prototype radios and that Harold had been the best solder man at TI. Virgil had said that when the project was over, Harold had asked his supervisor for one of the prototypes, and the supervisor had said, "Harold, take whichever one you want. You earned it." Harold had taken PT3, not because it was special, but because it was the one closest to his bench. Patricia enclosed a photograph. It was a TI employee group shot from 1954. A dozen men in white shirts and ties standing behind a long lab bench covered in electronic components. Harold Jessup stood third from the left. He was 29 years old. He wore a white short-sleeved dress shirt and a narrow black tie. His hands were at his sides. On the bench in front of him, barely visible among the other components, were 4 small cream-colored objects in a row, the 4 prototypes all together. All before they went their separate ways, one to the Smithsonian, one to the Computer History Museum, one to the TI Archive, and one to a workbench in a garage in Sherman, Texas, where it would play the Farm Report every Saturday morning for 50 years. Leland had the photograph framed. It hangs above Harold's workbench in the garage, beside the Weller iron and the magnifying lamp. The workbench is empty now. The radio is in Mountain View. But the bench is still there, and the soldering station is still there. And if you stand in the garage on a Saturday morning and listen, you can almost hear the Farm Report coming through a speaker the size of a silver dollar, powered by 4 pieces of germanium and the cleanest solder joints a man ever laid. And the next Saturday morning, back home in Sherman, Leland sat down at his usual booth at the Kettle Restaurant on Texoma Parkway with his 2 oldest friends, Dale Overton and Buddy Willingham, the way he had every Saturday for 22 years. Dale looked at him over the rim of his coffee mug. "Heard you made the Herald Democrat, Leland." "Heard that." "Transistor radio, huh?" "Transistor radio." Buddy shook his head. $5. $5, Leland agreed. The 3 of them laughed, the quiet, chest-deep laugh of old men who have lived long enough to know that the world rarely sees what matters, and that sometimes, if you wait long enough, it finally does. A kid in a pawn shop looked at that radio and said $5. He didn't know. They never do. If stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel, because some things have hidden worth.